Hello everyone. Um, Welcome to Seven Pillars Community. My name is Rafiq. I am the founder of Seven Pillars Community, and I wanted to welcome everyone who's either listening or has been following the account since it was started. Um, this is the first live spaces that I've done, and I just wanted to introduce the whole concept and the platform and the channel basically to the audience, explain why it was created and introduce one of the central aspects of Seven Pillars community. So I guess while I'm waiting for people to join, I wanted to um, start off by saying that we live in very interesting times, and sometimes the the circumstances of the times require or incentivize the formation of new communities and the discussion of various topics that previously were not easily discussed or understood. And I'll just tell you a bit about my story and how I arrived at this destination. Um, so basically, I was a young attorney working in the United States, and I was had a regulatory job. I was working in Washington D.C., so I got a chance to see America up close from the institutional level, how things were done from a the sausage of government, how things start off with great ideas and then they get chewed up, and how special interest groups come in and they promote their pet projects. So I did that for a while, and then I went into private practice. And then after that, after several years of doing that, I decided to become an expat and work overseas. And as a result, I wound up in a foreign country and started to notice things from the perspective of an expat and from the perspective of looking outside in, and then from the perspective of seeing how other people relate to things in a different way and have different perspectives. So this was very eye-opening and educational for me. Um, Over time, you start to realize that much of the way we view the world is determined by the perspective that we're looking at them, you know, or the location and the culture and the values that we're taught. So we filter everything through that. So, and you start to realize different things. Different people think different ways about different issues. Um, so that was something I encountered, and it forces you to kind of reframe or reconsider some of your assumptions about the world, about America, about other countries. So that was something that was a process, a slow process of living overseas, and also just traveling and making friends with people from different cultures and religions and perspectives. So, having said that, um, one of the things I began to notice is the fact that certain countries tended to develop more than others. Some certain countries were more peaceful than others. Certain countries were more prosperous than others. Um, and then I also noticed that despite the differences in geography or differences in culture and differences in languages and things like that, there was something that was common to everyone, um, in terms of right and wrong, certain assumptions about the world that, you know, as you can imagine, most people, they leave a country or they go to a country because they want a better life and they want to be able to work and make a living, raise a family, and live happily. And they all want the same thing. They want safety, they want security, they want some measure of freedom, um, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, just so they can live, right? So you start to notice that no matter where people come from, and people often leave their homelands because these things are lacking or they're simply unattainable to the degree that they desire them. So people just move back and forth. Okay? So that's the perspective I'm coming from in terms of not only for myself, but for other people who I met. So what I began to notice is certain things that seemed almost intrinsic, so to speak, but essential, even I would say foundational to freedom. And what I meant by freedom is the kind of freedom that that really matters, the freedom to think for yourself, express yourself, but more fundamentally to live freely in terms of having a livelihood, freedom of movement, travel, um, freedom from fear, crime, things like that, to raise your family safely, um, and freedom to look forward to the future. In other words, a sense of optimism. Optimism meaning hope, looking forward into the future with a sense of anticipation about what may come and happiness about it, looking forward to it. So that was something I noticed, and um, I'll just tell you that, there are certain countries you can go to, and you probably, if you traveled to anywhere in the Far East or in the Middle East or Africa, um, Western Europe, even Eastern Europe, you'll notice differences in the level of infrastructure, the level of innovation, the level of prosperity in terms of jobs, in terms of products and services that are available, in terms of the rights and privileges that you may have, in terms of the things that make life livable. Um, and I would collectively just say different levels of freedom. Okay, individual freedom, but also collectively in terms of what you're as a nation or as a group or community, so to speak, that you're able to pursue your own happiness. All right. So I started to do a bit of reading, and I started to really reflect on as my experience as an American. What I learned about what freedom is, what it isn't, why it's so important. Other people call it liberty, right? Some people call it happiness. Um, some people call it, livelihood, right? As a matter of fact, there's that famous saying in the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We all know this growing up as Americans. It's a foundational document. So, um, over time, as I was living overseas, as an expat, I started to formulate an idea in my head, um, uh, which ultimately became something called the Seven Pillars of Freedom. It started off as a something on a napkin that I just wrote, and it's kind of weird because I went to there's a country you go to, and you feel the energy of a country that's developing, and you see the construction, you see the the infrastructure is being built. You see a lot of energy in that country, and you can feel it. You know, the energy of the people and everything. And the one thing I noticed, in every country, you have buildings. It's something. It's an archetype, I guess. Buildings. Every building has a process by which it's constructed. Okay. And I guess, one of the benefits of going to a developing country or a country that's dynamic, that's growing, that's things are happening, is you see a lot of construction, and you start to see things, construction sites. And one of the things that struck out to me, which I latched onto, partly because of the job that I had, and also my profession, I was constantly seeing construction, construction sites, cranes and excavation, right? So the idea came into my head about, the, the foundation. And, whenever you want to build a building or you want to construct something, you can't just start randomly laying bricks. You have to first develop a solid foundation. And so you typically have to find a site which is obviously free from obstructions and things like that. You have to clear the site, but then you have to dig into the ground. This is what you notice if you've worked in construction or you've been around construction sites. You have to build a building first by excavating and developing the site, the foundations of the site. So what you'll notice is that you have a crane or what do you call it? One of those trucks that excavate with shovels, excavation trucks, and they dig up the dirt and they keep digging, and then what you do is you start something called you start digging piles into the ground, right? And you start digging into the ground to determine the strength of the foundation. You're looking for obstructions, right? You're looking for water. You want to find out where the water table is. You want to get down to the bedrock of the site that you're about to construct on, because you want to make sure that before you lay anything on that site, before you lay any pillars on that site, before you lay any concrete, you first have to make sure that that site is level and that it's a strong foundation. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense to people. These are things you just take for granted if you're just walking up and down the street, but for some reason, this image stuck in my mind because I saw so many buildings being constructed, and I became familiar with this whole process. So I started to notice, what they were doing. They were digging up the site, moving dirt, and they would lay down these piles with these machines that keep digging under the ground. And it's called, they would call something called shoring and enabling works. Shoring and enabling works, if you know anything about construction. So what they would do is they'd shore up the foundation. They have to dig in the ground, first make sure that the water is removed, pump the water out to make sure you have a firm foundation. And then once you remove the water and you have a firm foundation, what do? You first have to lay the right pillars or enabling and shoring works. That means you have to lay um, work so that if you notice you have these barriers that keep the sides of the site because you're digging into the site. You have to keep them from falling in. So you have to put temporary walls around the site as you're digging to keep the dirt from falling in. It has to be strong. And then after that, when you do that, you keep digging, digging, digging. You remove the water. Then you start laying these piles. These are like little concrete piles, which shore up the foundation. And then you lay concrete at the base level of the foundation. That's your base level. Okay. If you've seen a construction site, or if you've ever just walked past it on your way to work or on the way home or in your lunch break, you've noticed this, right? The guys with the hard hats on, and then eventually you start to see them. See these machines that dig down, right? And then you see them lay uh, wooden panels. Usually it's like wooden panels, metal panels against the walls of the site, construction site, and they're going down, digging down, and then they lay these concrete piles, right? And then they lay the concrete for the first level, the base level. Okay. So this stuck in my mind, and I started to realize, that this is a metaphor for the foundation of freedom. Because just like a building that you want to construct, a tall building, the taller the building, the more grandiose the building, the stronger the building. But any building at all, whether it's a home, whether it's a tall skyscraper, the very first thing you need to do before you do anything else is you have to have a very, very firm foundation, and you have to establish the foundation. Okay? So I think you can see where I'm getting at here, but part of today's podcast or live space is because I wanted to talk about the most important aspect of freedom before you get into anything else, before you construct any of the pillars of the building that you're trying to construct. You have to have a firm foundation. So now, when we say foundation, like you said, we mean something has to be level, has to be flat, it has to be strong, it has to be able to support the weight of whatever you're constructing upon it, right? So this is in the physical world, the natural world. But these physical structures, they are based on principles, right? Natural law principles. When you want to do construction, before you can do any construction, you have to go to school and you have to learn the principles of civil engineering. And part of the principles of civil engineering, you have to learn math, physics, right? The principles of engineering, weight, how to construct weight bearing structures, right? So, and this is the physical or natural laws, right? These are invisible, these are principles upon which we build physical things. So, similarly, I started to think about, you know, if we're going to be free and we're going to build something that enables us to sustain our freedom in the same way you build a building to enable you to live in a home or conduct business or do whatever you're doing, you have to establish it on sound principles. And just as in the physical world, we know that 1 + 1 = 2. We know the laws of gravity. We know the laws of, concrete mixture. We know the laws of chemistry, um, how much weight can be rest upon a structure. We have a similar understanding in the laws of morality or reason. They're very similar. So that's where the topic of today's live space is about, because we're fortunate in that we inherited many, many lessons from previous civilizations that were built before us and that we inherited from. And one of the major concepts was a concept called logos, right? It's a very ancient word. It goes back to Greek philosophy, and it's a very unique word, but it has a lot of different meanings. But I'm sure you can probably see that that is the root word from where words like logic comes from, right? Or the word logo comes from, right? And what does that word mean? Well, it means reason. It means order, right? Reason and order. It also has extended meaning of morality, right? Logic, rationality. And the Greeks who developed this term, introduced this term, they saw logos as the origin of everything and the purpose of everything, you know. And in Christianity, it became synonymous with God or the divine creator or nature itself, the origin of nature, logos. And so uh, any type of physical or even metaphysical reality had to be based upon logos. It originate from logos and be based upon logos. In other words, it had to be consistent with some type of primordial order. And if you look around, and the Greeks did look around, they looked around and they were able to discover these principles by reflection, observation, and they documented these principles, and they developed the sciences like geometry and trigonometry and Pythagorean theorem. They discovered a lot of different things, which we benefit from. But what's not often realized is that in addition to the physical laws, there were certain moral laws of the universe that needed to be developed or discovered. And many of us, we may implicitly know them, but we may not always explicitly acknowledge them until there's so much disorder that it becomes impossible to ignore the absence of those principles in practice. Does that make sense? So just to go back to our analogy, um, if you don't lay a proper foundation, or let's say you do lay a proper foundation for a building. I'm sure you've all seen this. Just using this metaphor, um, it's a beautiful building. You see them lay it. You see them construct all the core pillars of the building. Suddenly, they build the exterior. You see the floors going up. They build the exterior. They put the label on the building. Eventually, they do the fit out, right? And now the building is complete and you have a grand opening, people living there, right? And everything's fine, right? But what if, in the first scenario, I'm going to give you the first scenario, but what if that building was built on a weak foundation? In other words, let's say the engineers who built the building, they decided that they didn't calculate the proper load bearing requirements for the building, and so they constructed pillars that were unable to support the rest of the structure. Let's say it wasn't a huge miscalculation, but only a slight one. Okay, and it was only noticeable over time. So the more the weight, the load of the weight or load bearing weight rested, the weaker or the more structurally defective the building became, and it was undiscovered or unrecognized. And eventually, and so you can see where I'm going with this, eventually the building suddenly it begins to tilt to the side, or in the worst case scenario, it just collapses. And then the questions are asked about why the building collapsed. And usually they go back to the design of the building and they go back to errors in the design, errors in the construction of the building, right? And sometimes those errors relate to poor foundation, or it could be not just the foundation, but other aspects of the building that were defective. Sometimes you can have the pillars were not designed to carry the weight equally. So that's another aspect, which we'll get into later. But in this particular live space, I just wanted to talk about logos because the most important aspect is the foundation stone of the building. And similarly, I was thinking about all these societies that people live in, to the extent that they're free or not free, no matter how beautiful the exterior is, no matter how beautiful the structure on top that you see the visible reality of the country in terms of its buildings, its institutions, and its all the things that we visibly see. Um, One thing that must remain robust, strong, and built to withstand the pressure of time and the pressure of uncertainty and you know conflict, stress, in the same way that a building must be designed, depending on where it's constructed and how tall it is, and it must be constructed to withstand the earthquakes, you know, uh, even the settling of the foundation. Sometimes the ground will settle, so it has to be able to calculate the inevitable changes over time so that it's able to withstand those things. And that has to be based on sound principles. This is the point I'm trying to make. So what I'm saying is that no matter what nation you go to, the principles remain the same. If those principles are sound, just like any building, no matter what building you go to in any country, anywhere in the world, any house you go to, those are universal principles that must be respected. They must be honored. Logic, rationality, reason, order, or the word that encompasses all of that is logos, the Greek word logos. So there must be a respect for the principles, for the foundation to be strong. And if you don't respect reason, logic, order. If there are errors in it, if there are weaknesses in it, or worse still, let's say, for example, and going back to my analogy, let's say that the building was constructed on sound principles. However, there is a concept of, degradation, settlement, or um, lack of maintaining the foundation as a result of, let's say, there was cracks and start to appear in the foundation due to neglect, right? Sometimes you have to, as you can imagine, you have to refurbish, you have to reestablish the foundation, strengthen the foundation, right? This is something that is quite common in engineering, construction. That's why you have to have operations and maintenance, right? In construction, you just can't construct things and then leave it. You have to operate it and maintain it. They go hand in hand. You have predictive maintenance, you have preventative maintenance, right? So if we just take that metaphor with logos as a foundation of society, the things that the universal laws of nature or the universal laws of morality, or natural law, right? Some people call it morality, right and wrong, justice, fairness, right? They have to be operated and maintained. You can't just lay them down in the beginning, but then neglect them. If you do that over time, you will get cracks in your foundation. You'll get cracks uh, that ultimately can bring down the building. So this is the concept of logos. It's the idea that every society, every nation, just like a building, to stand tall, to be sustaining, freestanding, in other words, to be freestanding, to be free, to stand freely, it must rest upon a sound foundation. And that foundation, either in the physical world and in the law of civility or civil society, human relations, it must rest upon logos, a respect for order, a respect for reason, a respect for morality, right, basic, right and wrong. This is the point. And you must never lose sight of that to the point where you neglect those principles. Because if you do, over time, your nation will collapse, no matter how powerful it is, no matter how tall the building is, no matter how old
Great.
the building is. So I guess I'll pause there because I think I introduced the concept. That's the first concept of seven pillars is the logos foundation, and I just wanted to just open it up in case anyone had any comments about what I'm saying, um, and feel free to speak if anybody's there. Would anyone like to say anything or ask questions?
Yeah, I was just saying, Mr. Rafiq, that it's very relevant what you're speaking. I can connect it with my country as well.
Oh, okay, where are you from?
I am from India.
You're from. Okay, so you understand what?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. So, what did you think about the concept of logos? Does that it make sense to you?
Yes, it makes sense to not just one country, but I think these problems are associated with most of the countries right now.
Right, right, right. So, I mean, what do you think about the metaphor? I mean, I guess because, you know, the metaphor is kind of like countries are kind of like buildings, um, and countries are made up of many, many people because they have to construct the building. You have your architectural design, you have your construction team, right? You have your engineers, civil engineers, electrical engineers. You have so many different types of people that go in to construct a building. And it takes time to build a building. You just can't imagine it in your head. It has to be developed over time, and it takes a lot of effort, a lot of resources, right? And if you put all of that effort into building something, whether it's a building, a tall standing skyscraper, a house, a university, whatever it is, and you neglect that building, you neglect the foundations, the well, either it's the foundations of the building, either at the and during the design or even during the construction, because you can have a great design, right? You can have a great design for a building and it can be architecturally sound in terms of the measurements. But let's say in the course of constructing the building, you don't pay attention to the construction to make sure it follows the design. You can have problems there. So you can have similarly, just using the same analogy, you can have a country that is has all the right principles, based on the right principles, right? The sound principles. But in the course of establishing the country and constructing, carrying things out, they don't pay adherence to those principles. So you wind up with a horrible situation. Um, a lot of damage is done, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, that definitely makes sense.
Yeah. So, part of the whole concept of seven pillars is we recognize first and foremost is that we are all bound by certain universal principles of order and morality and law and justice, regardless of where you come from or who you are, what you look like, or anything like that. And we all have to pay respect to reason and logic. Um, And if we do that, then we can construct things and we can build a society and we can sustain it. But what we see today um, is that many great countries or great societies can slowly collapse because they fail to uphold the principles upon which that foundation rests, right? And as a result, no matter how powerful or how strong or how visually impressive any building can be, it can be glittering. It can have many, many, many floors. It can be the tallest building in the world, right? But if it does not respect or secure or strengthen, or if it allows the foundation to be eroded, then no matter how tall that building is, no matter how strong the pillars are, it will collapse. And similarly, even if you have a strong foundation, if your pillars are not sound, then the building will not remain freestanding for a very long time. And we've seen that. You've seen examples of that. So you can either have the foundation to be weak, right? So that everything built upon it has no firm foundation to rest upon and it collapses. That's one scenario. You can have a situation where the foundation is strong, but the pillars are not correctly established or balanced in each other, so they're not able to um, sustain the building. We've seen that situation before, right? Poorly constructed. And then you have a situation, you have a building that's constructed properly, right? Designed properly, completed building, right? But over time, through neglect, the foundations become weak and erode, and even the pillars themselves can erode because they're not maintained. They're not, there isn't a check, routine preventative maintenance, identifying cracks and things like that. We see this, making sure you're inspecting things to make sure there's if any cracks appear, you refurbish them, you strengthen them periodically. This is important, and if it's just as is important in construction of buildings, it's important in the maintenance or construction of societies, communities, nations. So that's something that occurs. And then, of course, the last scenario is, I just talked about that's passive neglect. That's an aspect. But then there's also active destruction, right? If you ever been to a construction site and they want to clear the way for a new building, what do? They plant explosives or demolition of the building, right? And they have to get in order to bring the building down, what do they have to do? They have to go to the foundation of the building. They have to go to the base of the pillar, and they have to detonate uh, explosives at the base of the building to weaken the pillars and weaken the foundation so that the building will collapse, right? So this is where, if you want to build another building, you had to remove the old building. So in construction techniques, you have special experts that they specialize in demolition, right? So that's a metaphor for expressing how, sometimes if you have countries or communities that are not careful, um, or if there's disputes between countries, or sometimes you can have efforts by bad actors or things like that to destroy uh, the foundations of a country, the foundations of the building. And this can happen over time. It can also, it takes, just like a demolition expert, it takes time. You have to plan those things. These are not haphazard things. You have to plan them. So if the respect for law and justice and order is not respected by one group of people against another group of people, then they can easily, just like a demolishing a building, they can demolish a community or a country by getting at the foundations, the logos. Even the strongest nation in the world, if it doesn't respect the foundations upon which it's built, if you weaken, if you allow yourself to weaken those foundations, then no matter how strong you are, no matter how old your society is, no matter what it is, it can easily be conquered from within or collapse from within. Does that make sense? So does that make sense? I think your mic is on. I mean, your mic is turned off. But I guess that's really the point I wanted to make. Um, so I wanted to discuss logos. So just to recap what we've learned today, we introduced the Seven Pillars community, and the very first concept of the Seven Pillars community is logos, which is a Greek word, which is a comprehensive word that has many different meanings, but it means the order of the universe. It can mean natural law, reason, logic, morality. All those things wound up in one. It also has been referred to as the origin of everything. God has been referred to as the Logos because he's the source of order and morality. And we wanted to explain that just as in buildings have to rest upon a foundation, a solid foundation, right? That when we say solid foundation, we mean respect for first principles, respect for the principles of physics, engineering, all the sciences, right? You have to respect those things, and your foundation has to be built upon those principles correctly, right? Before you do anything else. And similarly, in any society, any government, any nation has to do the same thing. So, um, I guess with that said, I'll turn it over to um, anyone else that has something to say. And if not, I want to thank you for joining us, listening to the podcast. And if you like what you heard, I'd greatly appreciate if you could share it with someone and visit our website and sevenpillars.com and uh, follow us on Instagram, X, and YouTube. And look forward to the next live space. Okay. Well, thank you, and talk to you again soon.